All right, so get ready because today we're going to take a deep dive into something pretty fascinating, maybe even a little mind-bending.
Oh, I like mind bending.
Yeah, right. We're talking about the possibility of inheriting memories. Like, what if your love of music or fear of spiders isn't just from your parents, but actually came from, like, your great-great-grandmother? Kind of wild to think about, right?
It is, and there's a growing body of research suggesting that's not as far-fetched as it might sound.
Exactly, and that's what we are diving into today. We've got a whole bunch of research to unpack, actually.
Oh, yeah. Like what?
Well, we've got this research paper on something called phenotypic plasticity. It's a pretty dense one, but we'll break it down. Then there's some interesting stuff from Ancestry.com about their genetic communities feature, which is all about how shared environments can influence genetics. And to top it off, we've got excerpts from a scientific podcast interview with Dr. Oded Rachabi.
Oh, I know his work. He's a neurobiology professor doing some really groundbreaking research on genetic inheritance.
Exactly. We'll be pulling some key insights from his work, and we've even got some bits from the National Institute on Drug Abuse and UC Irvine's Center for the Neurobiology of Learning and Memory, just to round things out.
Wow. Sounds like we've got a lot of ground to cover.
We do. But luckily, we have you here to help us make sense of it all. So let's jump right in. We all know that we inherit physical traits from our parents, like eye color or height. That's basic genetics 101, right? But what about the things we learn or experience during our lives? Can those somehow change what we pass on to our kids?
That's the million-dollar question. And for a long time, scientists thought the answer was a hard no. Like, the idea that experiences could actually change the genes you pass on is kind of tied to this old theory called Lamarckian evolution.
Right, like the classic example of giraffes stretching their necks to reach leaves and then their offspring being born with longer necks.
Exactly. But that theory has been largely discredited. Modern genetics tells us that it's more about natural selection. Like, giraffes with slightly longer necks just happen to be more likely to survive and reproduce, so they passed on those genes.
So it's not that the giraffes were changing their genes by stretching, it's that the ones with the right genes were the ones who survived.
Exactly.
Okay, so Lamarck might be wrong, but that doesn't mean our experiences have zero impact, right?
Absolutely not. There's this whole field of study called epigenetics. Yeah,
Epigenetics.
and it basically explores how experiences can modify how genes are expressed.
Hold on, so you're saying that our experiences can actually change how our genes work?
Well, not change the actual DNA sequence, but how those genes are used.
Okay, so it's not rewriting the genetic code, but more like, I don't know, adding notes or highlighting certain sections.
That's actually a really good analogy.
Yeah.
Think of it this way. The genes are like the hardware, but epigenetics is like the software.
Oh, I like that.
It's the code that tells the hardware what to do. And just like software, it can be updated and modified based on our experiences.
Okay, so experiences can kind of tweak the software, but how does that affect future generations?
Well, here's the thing. These epigenetic changes, these notes and highlights on the genetic code, sometimes they can be passed down to our offspring.
Wait, seriously?
Yeah, it's like they inherit a slightly modified operating system, which can then influence how their own genes are expressed.
So it's not like inheriting specific memories, like remembering grandma's apple pie recipe, more like inheriting I don't know, predispositions or tendencies.
Exactly. It's about inheriting a slightly different starting point based on the experiences of your ancestors.
Still, that's pretty mind-blowing. But how do we even know this is happening? What's the evidence?
One of the most compelling pieces of evidence comes from research on a tiny little organism called C. elegans. It's a type of microscopic worm.
Worms. Wait, those little guys can help us understand inheritance in humans?
Believe it or not, they can. C. elegans is super useful for studying genetics. They reproduce quickly, have short lifespans, and their entire genome has been mapped out.
Okay, so you can really see what's going on with their genes.
Exactly. And we can even manipulate their genes and observe the effects across generations.
That's pretty handy. So what kind of discoveries have been made with these worms?
Well, one groundbreaking study found that when C. elegans are infected with a virus, their offspring inherit resistance to that specific virus.
Hold on, so even though the offspring had never encountered the virus before, they were somehow prepared for it.
Exactly. And the key to this inherited resistance lies in RNA molecules.
RNA. Isn't that the messenger molecule that carries instructions from DNA?
It is. But it turns out RNA can do much more than just deliver messages. In this case, small RNA molecules act like cellular messengers, carrying the memory of the virus to the next generation. And get this, These RNA molecules can actually interfere with the virus's genetic code, protecting the offspring from infection.
So it's like the parent worms are giving their offspring a tiny weapon to fight off the virus. That's incredible. But does this resistance last forever?
That's another fascinating part. We found that the inherited resistance fades after a few generations. There's a set of genes, called MoTec genes, that seem to act as a timer, limiting how long these inherited traits persist.
Oh, interesting. So it's like a temporary immunity boost. But why would that be
Well,
beneficial?
it makes sense from an evolutionary perspective. Environments change. Holding on to resistance to a threat that no longer exists could actually be a disadvantage.
Yeah, like being prepared for the wrong battle. You'd be wasting resources and energy.
Right.
So we've talked about inheriting viral resistance, but are there any other examples of traits being passed down this way?
Yeah, actually, we've also found that worms can inherit changes in behavior because of environmental stress.
Like what?
Well, for example, worms that were exposed to high temperatures produced offspring that were more likely to mate with males rather than self-fertilizing.
So the stressed worms were like, hey, let's shake things up genetically to improve our chances of survival.
Exactly. It's a fascinating example of how experiences can influence not just physical traits, but also complex behaviors in future generations.
This is blowing my mind. I'm already rethinking everything I thought I knew about inheritance.
And we've only just scratched the surface. We're going to delve into even more fascinating research coming up.
Okay, I am ready.
We're going to be talking about some research on, well, how cold temperatures can actually extend the memory of learned associations in worms.
Okay, freezing worms. What does that have to do with anything? How do you even, like, freeze a memory in a worm?
It's a good question. It all started with kind of a scientific accident, actually.
Oh,
Yeah, we were studying how worms learn to avoid certain smells that they associate with bad experiences,
yeah.
like starvation.
Teaching them what not to eat.
Exactly. But we were getting frustrated because their memories are, well, pretty short. They forget the association after just a couple of hours.
So not the best students then.
Not in that particular way, no. But anyway, I had this idea. What if we froze the worms right after they learned? Like, would they still remember the association when we thawed them out?
It's like hitting the pause button on their memory.
Exactly. And guess what? It worked.
Really?
Yeah. When we thawed them out, those frozen worms, they remembered the association much longer than the control worms who weren't frozen. We're talking like 10 times longer.
Wow, that's wild. So it wasn't just the cold slowing everything down, like their brains were actually holding on to the memory better.
That's what the evidence suggests. We even did another experiment where we acclimated the worms to colder temperatures before we taught them the association and then froze them. And that time, the freezing didn't extend their memory at all.
Huh. So it was the sudden drop in temperature that did something, like triggered something.
Right, the sudden change seems to be key. And this is where it connects back to what we were talking about earlier, the ability to adapt to challenging environments.
Right.
Worms, like a lot of other organisms, they have mechanisms to help them survive freezing temperatures.
Oh, yeah, like producing antifreeze or something?
Yeah, they have those kinds of adaptations, but they also have changes in how their cells function at a molecular level. And we think those cold tolerance mechanisms might actually be linked to the extended memory we saw in those frozen worms. It's like their whole system goes into a preservation mode.
So the worms are basically flipping a switch that says, hold on to these memories, they might be important for survival later.
That's a great way to put it. And what's even more exciting, we've actually identified some specific genes that seem to be involved. When we mutated those genes, the worms, they remembered the learned association for much longer, even without being frozen.
Wait, so those genes are like controlling how long a memory lasts?
It seems that way. And here's the really wild part. Those genes, they're primarily expressed in just one pair of neurons in the worm's brain.
Out of all the neurons, just two are responsible for how long a memory lasts.
It's remarkable, isn't it? It suggests that memory duration might be regulated by very specific genetic and neural mechanisms.
Incredible. But how does this all relate back to us? Like, do humans have similar genes controlling our memories?
Well, we're still a long way from fully understanding how memory works in humans, but this research does give us some clues. You mentioned earlier that people used to think dunking kids in cold water would help them remember things.
Oh, yeah, I always thought that was just an old wives' tale.
Well, we know now that cold exposure can trigger the release of adrenaline, which can enhance memory formation. And this worm research, it suggests that cold might also play a role in how long those memories are actually retained.
So maybe those old wives were onto something.
Maybe? This research opens up a whole new way of thinking about how environmental factors, like temperature, could be shaping how we learn and remember. Not just in the moment, but potentially even over generations.
Okay, now I'm really curious about that phenotypic plasticity paper you mentioned earlier. What's that all about?
Oh yeah, that paper. That one explores how organisms can actually change their traits and behaviors in response to their environment.
So, not just genetic changes, but like actual physical or behavioral changes within a lifetime.
Exactly. It's about how flexible organisms are
Hmm.
in adapting to their surroundings. Like, for example, the paper talks about how chickens raised in different light conditions, they develop different sized eyes, or how guppies that are exposed to predators, they develop different coloration patterns.
So, it's like their environment is shaping them, like in real time. That makes me wonder, are there any examples of this happening in humans?
There's actually a really interesting example from Ancestry.com's Genetic Communities feature. They found this cluster of people in West Virginia who, despite having very diverse genetic ancestries, all shared a common ancestor from like hundreds of years ago.
So, people with different backgrounds all converged on the same location and ended up with like a unique genetic fingerprint.
Right. And it suggests that their shared environment, the specific challenges and opportunities of that region, West Virginia, well, it might have played a role in shaping their genetics over time.
That's pretty amazing. It really shows how nature and nurture are constantly like intertwined.
Absolutely. And it brings us back to the question of whether memories can be inherited. While inheriting like specific memories of events, that's probably unlikely, but inheriting predispositions that shape how we respond to our environment, that seems much more plausible.
Okay, yeah, I'm starting to see the bigger picture here. It's not about inheriting like specific memories, but inheriting a framework for how we learn and adapt.
Exactly. And that framework, shaped by both genetics and epigenetics, it influences how we interact with the world and ultimately, shapes who we become.
That's mind-blowing. I'm starting to feel like we're just scratching the surface of something really profound here. So, we've talked about inheriting predispositions. Things like, viral resistance or even a tendency to mate a certain way. But is there any chance we could actually inherit specific memories? Like remembering a conversation or a particular event?
Hmm. That's where things get a bit more, well, speculative. You see, our brains, they don't really store memories in a way that could be easily translated into a genetic or epigenetic code.
Okay, but you mentioned earlier that some like very specific types of memories might be heritable. What did you mean by that?
Well, think back to the worms, right? They inherited those changes in mating behavior after being exposed to stress. But in that case, we're talking about a very specific innate behavior, something that's hardwired into their nervous system. It's not like remembering a random fact or, a personal experience.
So it's easier to imagine inheriting something that's already part of our biological programming,
Yeah.
like instincts.
Exactly. With the worms, that stress that the parents experienced, well, it likely caused some epigenetic changes that affected the genes controlling mating behavior. And those changes were passed down to the offspring, which influenced their mating choices.
Okay, that makes sense for worms. But I mean, we're not worms. How does this relate to specific memories in humans?
We do have innate behaviors and instincts that are, crucial for our survival. Things like our fear response, our drive to find food and shelter, our desire to connect with others. These are very deeply rooted in our biology and influenced by genes that have been shaped by, well, evolution over millions of years.
So could it be possible that some of our like deepest fears or strongest desires are actually influenced by experiences our ancestors had? Not specific events, but maybe like the overall conditions they lived in.
That's a question that researchers are, really actively exploring. And while we don't have all the answers yet, there is growing evidence that trauma, for example, can leave epigenetic marks on our genes. And those marks, well, they can be passed down.
Like that study about the descendants of Holocaust survivors, how they have different stress hormone levels.
Exactly. It's a powerful example of how traumatic experiences can have a really lasting impact, not just on individuals, but potentially on their children and grandchildren. It's almost as if the echo of that trauma, in some form, is actually carried in their biology.
That's both incredible and, honestly, a little terrifying. It makes you think about the responsibility we have for our actions and the potential impact they could have on future generations.
It really does. If experiences can modify inheritance, even temporarily, it definitely changes how we think about our choices and their ripple effects through time.
It's like a whole new dimension of legacy. We're not just leaving behind like physical things or stories, we might actually be shaping the biological and behavioral tendencies of our descendants.
It really highlights the interconnectedness of life, don't you think?
Hmm.
And the importance of understanding how our experiences, both good and bad, can influence not only our own lives, but also the lives of those who come after us.
This has been an absolutely amazing deep dive. We've gone from basic genetics to microscopic worms to the profound implications of inherited predispositions. Honestly, I need some time to process all of this.
It's a lot to take in for sure, but it's also incredibly exciting. The more we learn about inheritance and epigenetics, well, the more we realize just how much more there is to discover.
Well, thank you so much for guiding us through this fascinating world of genetics and the mind-boggling possibility of inheriting memories. I think we all need to like sit with these ideas for a while and just see where they take us.
It's been my pleasure. And remember, the journey of scientific discovery, it never really ends. Who knows what incredible breakthroughs are just around the corner?
To everyone listening, keep those questions coming, keep exploring, and keep diving deep. Until next time.